Vehicle use in terms of its variable costs, such as fuel, us to indicate help to indicate the affordability of driving, and perhaps one of the biggest reasons driving is such a popular mode of transportation in North America. When we compare Toronto with its North American counterparts, the cost of fuel is quite similar. However, when compared to London, Amsterdam, and Hong Kong, we can see that fuel is quite cheap in comparison. This could potentially help to explain why automobile use is much less in those cities in comparison to Toronto and other cities of North America. By increasing the cost of fuel, perhaps driving could be seen as a less desirable mode of transportation, and it could potentially change the transportation habits of its residents if other modes are seen as more convenient, affordable, and accessible. Parking costs also give us an indication of Toronto's transportation profile in a more international perspective. When comparing Toronto's parking costs, they seem to be on par with North America, but much cheaper than, say, in Hong Kong and in London. By increasing the costs associated with parking, we could potentially see a change in transportation usage as well. Attitudes to cars can also be compared as well. Within cities, it seems not necessary, particularly within the cities on the left. However, if we do look at the cities on the right, particularly within the suburban regions, a lot of these cities, most of them are in North America, except for London, car usage does seem to be a necessity. So these cities are more spread out as well. So we also see more kind of we see housing in terms of like more detached housing and things like that, so less dense settlement. If we look at explicit TDM policies, we can see that Toronto does not really have that many policies in place at the moment, barring an express toll route highway. Even compared with even compared with Seattle, for example, Toronto's TDM policies are lacking. However, they are being developed as of now, but they are not necessarily fully kind of operational at the moment. Next, we can look at public transport. So here we can compare the cities in terms of public transit industry structure and regulation. Although Toronto's system is a public monopoly, and its system is inadequate, a city such as New York and also is in a similar situation, as well as Amsterdam in terms of having a public monopoly. So although Toronto could look to cities such as London, which have a more kind of a shift to the center approach, we do see cities that have a pretty extensive network like Hong Kong and Amsterdam and New York also having public monopolies. So Toronto can continue with this model. However, it can look at other cities in terms of what works in terms of different types of industry structures and regulations. Attitudes of public transit are similar in terms of a North American perspective. When we compare Toronto to other North American cities, the attitudes are similar in that there are some mixed feelings about usage. For some it is adequate, for others it is not necessarily the case. In Las Vegas for tourists, in Seattle kind of confusing or sporadic. However, if we look at countries such as Amsterdam and Hong Kong, public transit is seen as a very attractive, convenient, and efficient and inexpensive mode of transportation, also giving an indication of why these cities may have greater public transit usage in comparison, or more balanced transportation kind of use. We can also compare bicycle and pedestrian conditions, which also give us an indication of where Toronto stands in terms of this mode of transportation. So starting with bicycle conditions. So until recently, cycling was not necessarily seen as a real viable option for transportation. However, in the last 2 to 3 years, huge sums of money have been invested in bicycle infrastructure by the province, making it an even more attractive mode of transit. The Ontario government has now mandated that all street planning include bicycle lane infrastructure, which is a big kind of move that's been made since last year. Although in the previous slide we can see that clearly the demarcated green areas here, we can see that there are many streets that have kind of unmarked bicycle lanes are not clearly marked. Also, a big problem is vehicle operators' their views of bicycle lanes. A growing issue is many, choosing to use these as parking or for drop off, and things like that. So enforcement is an important aspect when it comes to ensuring safe cycling conditions. The infrastructure could be there, but it's not. If it's not a safe alternative for transportation, ridership levels will not necessarily increase. So there needs to be a kind of shift in values as well as increased enforcement. If we compare to Amsterdam, as we discussed in class and we saw previously, Amsterdam is known for its large number of cyclists and expansive cycling infrastructure. Toronto can learn a lot from Amsterdam if it wishes to see more cycling instead of using other methods of transportation. Barcelona also has a pretty expansive network when compared with Toronto. So we see a kind of trend in Europe towards more bicycle-friendly streets and infrastructure. However, if we look at Las Vegas, although it's arguably America's bicycle-friendly city, it has more miles in total than Portland. However, the lanes are not necessarily separated from the roadway, and they don't appear to be kind of providing the most safest conditions for cyclists. And also, motorist attitudes are still very set in an auto-centric kind of way. So there's not necessarily the kind of consciousness of that cyclists are using or sharing the road with these cars. London is beginning to look at Amsterdam increasingly in terms of looking at developing its bicycle infrastructure. However, as we previously saw, cycling still remains quite low when compared to other means of transportation. In years to come, however, with a continued focus on developing infrastructure, we may see increased popularity. LA, again, cycling is not necessarily seen as transportation, more so if we look at the bottom picture here, it's more of a leisure activity. So kind of similar attitudes in North America in terms of bicycling infrastructure. However, if we look at New York, which seems to be the most progressive in terms of transportation of all the North American cities, the streets have undergone transformation. More than 250 miles of traffic lanes dedicated for bicycles have been created, and several laws intended to promote cycling have been passed. The efforts by the Bloomberg administration have placed the city at the forefront of a national trend to make bicycling viable and safe in even the most urban of settings. Yet over the last year or two, there's been a lot of backlash. Many car driving lobbyist groups have tried to fight against losing lanes of traffic to bicycle infrastructure. So there's still a value shift, and there is quite a strong car lobbying movement. However, New York has been quite progressive in trying to, promote bicycle infrastructure. Seattle is quite a progressive city too in terms of its bicycle infrastructure. So I think if we compare Toronto and Seattle, I think they're on a similar page. However, like looking at Los Angeles, which seems to be quite car-centric still, Toronto is, moving ahead in terms of its bicycle infrastructure, increasing ridership. Lastly, we can compare pedestrian conditions. Toronto is kind of seen as quite a walkable city. However, there's been some debate about this lately. A journalist named Christopher Hume has produced a video of things they hate about Toronto in the last few weeks, and he talks about walking conditions in Toronto.
One of the things I hate about this city is the street furniture. I don't know what the city was thinking when it entered into the deal, but we got the wrong end of it. This is a typical example right here. This is an information post. There's no information on this. This is an advertising vehicle, pure and simple, and positioned so that it blocks the most number of pedestrians. To make matters worse, we have garbage bins that fall apart routinely, benches that nobody wants to sit on, trees that are dying, poles that are in the way. What's with the city? Why can't it get something simple like street furniture right? For thestar.com, I'm Christopher Hume.
However, if we compare Toronto to, say, cities like Los Angeles, it is in much better shape. However, Seattle, it can learn a lot from which it has focused a lot in recent times on creating a more walkable city. Toronto is making its way in terms of making more walkable kind of conditions and more walkable friendly city. However, there is still some things that it needs to work on clearly, as evidenced by the video. So in conclusion, a number of patterns do emerge. When comparing Toronto with its North American counterparts, we do see that it is still a very automobile-centric city in some regards. However, public transit usage is relatively higher than in other North American cities, barring New York. If greater investments are made into this system, though, we could probably see much increased usage. However, when comparing Toronto with other cities such as Amsterdam, we do see that there is still a lot to be learned with regard to creating a more balanced transportation system. Although with the establishment of Metrolinx, the Crown Agency, and its initiative called the Big Move, it still has a lot of catching up to do. However, with recent promises of billion-dollar investments in the next few decades, the municipal and provincial governments have been on board with trying to make some significant changes. We can expect to see some big things in the next decade. Whether this will meet with the increasing demand in Toronto as the city grows, we shall see in the future.